what I would like to do is introduce Ruth B. Esner. Ruth B. is with IDC Research, which is one of the premier research firms in the country and actually globally. So instead of reading through her bio, I want you to know I met Ruth B. at a Smart Cities conference in March, so it's been about 7-8 months. And as you know, Smart Cities has it's riding a wave right now, and a lot of people are interested, but I've been watching it for about 2 years. And what resonated with me with Ruth B. is the fact that she actually gets it. It's not about the technology, it's about serving citizens and meeting the need. So just a couple of highlights. Ruth B. is the Vice President of Government Insight at IDC, focusing on smart cities. A fun fact is that Ruth B. in January 2016 was presented the James Peacock 2015 Memorial Award for excellence in her contributions to IDC research. One other point I'd like to make is she is a graduate of Wesleyan University and also Boston College, where she graduated with an MBA and a master's in social work. So again, she shared with you some of the grit of the Boston area, and I think some of that will come across in her presentation. So without further ado, here's Ruth B.
So thank you so much for all of you that just sat through a panel on community engagement. I'm back. I'm not going to take your whole lunch hour, I promise. This is going to be a shorter, not a snackable presentation, but a shorter, more focused presentation. And what Darnell had asked me to talk about was some trends that are happening in smart cities and sort of the impact of smart cities and communities. So what that really boils down to is a quick agenda where I'm going to start a little high level on trends in smart cities, and we've heard some of them in some of the presentations earlier. Sort of the evolution of IT and how we think about technology within the municipal environment. And then really starting to think about what's happening with trends and investments and initiatives. And I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about what we call use cases, which really means solutions. And so how these solutions are being invested in by cities, what are the trends for relating these solutions, how we're starting to try to think strategically about these investments and some pilots and different types of point solutions, and then we'll end with some concluding thoughts. So I always start just by level setting very quickly what I mean by smart cities and communities. It's a really broad definition, and it's really about digital transformation of an urban ecosystem that's focused on outcomes. And so when we think about that, digital transformation implies the use of new models, new business models, new procurement models, IT innovation. When we think about the urban ecosystem, we can think about the city, the county, a region. We're looking at the different stakeholders really in a cohesive, interrelated ecosystem, right, that's happening around urban centers. And also that we're driving towards outcomes. So we don't ever talk about smart cities and communities in a vacuum in my mind. It always should be related to a social outcome, a financial outcome, an operational outcome, a programmatic outcome that you're looking for. So that just level sets where we are. And where I think we are with smart cities is at this really interesting intersection of not doing anything and really ramping up, and we're kind of in this chaotic middle ground of figuring things out. So I put the quote on there about chaos because I think there is a little bit of chaos happening as we transform and we change. So this is actually really similar to one of the panelists mentioned this earlier, looking at large trends. So I'm only going to spend a few minutes talking about this, but there are definite macro trends that are common to urban areas around the world that are impacting the way we think about solutions. And they have to do with rapid pace of innovation and technology that we just have a very hard time keeping up with, rapid population growth or even decline, really different income inequalities and the digital divide in terms of who's using what and who can access what, more severe weather events that are happening, and also just the management of infrastructure and resources as populations grow and you need more classrooms and your roads are getting clogged and you're having water scarcity. So this really is forcing us to say, how can we do things better? We can't build our way out of this. What is happening on the technology side that can help us solve some of these challenges? So when we think about what's happening with IT, it's really evolving. And it's been fascinating because I launched our Smart Cities program in 2011. And around that time, if you talked about IT, you talked about something that was kind of back office or had to do with your desktop, that was all about cost reduction and operational efficiency. It was servers and desktops and maybe, some Microsoft Office, but it was really a very different conversation. You had very traditional supplier relationships where you put an RFP and they responded and they gave you a service or you bought something. And now we started to see over time, starting in about 2014, this shift in technology as it really became pervasive with the residents and businesses, and it kind of started interspersing in everything. So we started to see that instead of thinking just about how technology was going to reduce your costs, and this is all kind of additive, right? So it's not like you don't think about technology reducing your costs now, but you also think about, how can I use technology to be innovative? How can I use technology to actually spur economic development? How can I use technology not just to engage the citizen, but to change the resident experience and to engage the community? And how can I think of my partners as potential innovators with me, as co-innovators, as new types of P3 models? So this whole conversation of how we traditionally did IT has really shifted dramatically over the past couple years. And I think that's part of what's happening with this chaos and transformation, is that there really is a change in view and role of the CIO and of the IT department, and it's really embedded in a different way in our life. So the other trend, of course, is that we talk about smart cities and communities because we're now seeing the results of some of these pilot efforts and some of the early movers. So the impact is there is actual results when you think of implementing some of these solutions. So I just put up a few examples. For example, if you switch to LED lighting and connected lighting, you can have significant reductions in energy and operational costs. If you switch and start to think about how you're using water, you can reduce the amount of water loss to leakage. If you think about parking and connected trash bins, there's all sorts of impacts that you can have that really are starting to spur the conversation into seeing how you can really change the life of people around you with some of these innovative use cases. And of course, behind all of this is the concept of the Internet of Things, which is that pretty much everything on the planet can have some sort of sensor or connectivity embedded in it, and that has lots and lots of implications for collecting data, for privacy, for managing data, and for managing your right-of-way and infrastructure. So part of this is really thinking about how do we control the chaos of things appearing on our streets, and how do we control sort of the use of these devices and this Internet of Thing information. So we had worked with New York City, and we had done, looking at a lot of their solutions, and we had done sort of a rough count. And this was actually in 2015. And so we came up with, for New York City, they had around anywhere from 2 to 3 million active devices on the streets. And they did not know what department was doing what. They did not know what data was being collected. Some of it was city-owned, some of it was possibly private, some of it was actively managed. It was a very scary very scary thing happening without a lot of oversight or control. And when you think about that for smaller cities, that still means thousands and thousands potential devices that you might be collecting data from, and that has a lot of implications. So I mention that because I think that's a very big trend and has a lot of impact on what the discussion we have with smart cities and communities. So what we tried to do to get a little more concrete is we started to research more and more on what were cities actually investing in, what were the pilots, and how did these trends actually start to affect dollars spent in actual programs. So we took on the left side and we simplified this so this could apply to any city. and said, what are the 5 strategic priorities that we really see cities focused on? And we've heard a lot of them today. Intelligent infrastructure, transportation, public safety, economic development and engagement. And then within those, what programs are they starting to develop? And I know the writing's small here, so you don't have to read all the little boxes. Just know that within those programs, we identified about 45 actual pilots or initiatives or funded discrete projects that we saw really emerging as investments in cities. And so the question is, what do we do about this knowledge, and how do we sort of think strategically about the use cases and investments that are happening with cities today? So the other interesting thing is we started to go and use we have a lot of analysts globally, and the Smart Cities practice is a global one. So we started to actually size some of these, what we call use cases. So an example of a use case could be officer wearables like headsets or body-worn video. V2X connectivity is how vehicles are connecting to intersections and streetlights or sensors on the street. And we started to say, okay, what's growing? Maybe not big, but growing. And so these are the top 5 global growing use cases. Officer wearables, V2X connectivity, smart trash collection, smart city platforms, and open data and data sharing. So still very tiny amounts being spent on them, but really growing over time. And then we started to look at, okay, what already has a lot of investment? And one of the interesting that came out was just the tremendous amount of money being spent on video cameras. And a lot of this was driven by China, because this is a global number, but it was just a tremendous amount of spending on what we call fixed visual surveillance. And there's a lot of implications about that. Traffic management, public transit, surveillance, outdoor lighting, and sort of that back office analytics and connected ERP applications were sort of the largest spending buckets. And when we started to look at it case by case, so actually looking at what cities who are sort of first movers in this were spending, we started with 50 cities, and we actually went through and said, how much are they spending on smart city projects? Because what we want to try to do is have a benchmark sense of what % of budget is being put in smart cities. How can you as a city understand what a similarly sized city in your region might be spending? And we do this for IT, but it's really hard to do it for smart cities because they often sit in different departments. They may not be part of a centralized IT budget. And so the question was how we could pull apart those different pieces. So this represents the spending just on those 45 use cases that I showed. It's not every smart city project. It's still looking at the spending on those 45 that we think are the most prevalent from now until the next couple years. And so what we're doing now is adding another 50 cities to try to get more data into this database to start to really understand the benchmarking of spending, and also look at it by strategic priority and also by technology. So what's being spent on services, what's being spent on hardware, what's being spent on connectivity? Because right now people have very little information about that, and they have very little guidance in terms of what other cities might be doing. So one of the things we also started to look at when we were looking at these use cases and how cities were spending was what is actually driving investment. And I think municipalities kind of know this already, but sometimes it's helpful for someone to sort of state it and put it in bullet points and put a framework around it. So one of the things that we find is if there's a clear funding path or revenue recuperation model. And sometimes the clear funding path is somebody's offering it to you for free, right? And there's no risk, and you're just going to get it for free, and it's all great. The other one is that it's a point solution that solves a specific problem that the public is complaining about, and you know that if you do it and you help, you're going to have a lot of happy businesses and residents. Example would be smart parking and journey finding to parking spots for things like that. The other is as part of a large capital budget of an existing investment, so we see things being layered on to fleet, asset management, fleet management, public transportation. The other thing that's really tending to push things is public outcry or demand. So, for example, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were less interested in water solutions and what was happening with water. But now, as we see several cities across the world just in the past year having really serious water scarcity and the predictions for that happening more and more, we bubble up water and water management and water monitoring, water quality monitoring as a significant area for looking at investment over time. And then, of course, there's solutions that combine some of these factors. So when we think about something that has a combination of a clear funding path and a noticeable solution, we look at things like, I mentioned smart parking and journey finding, smart kiosks on the street that may offer local business information or a Wi-Fi hotspot that people really enjoy, and then connected intelligent trash bins where they can, put a lot of trash. The environment is cleaner, the pickup is scheduled only when needed. And so these we see as a trend happening because they're, like I said, publicly noticeable, very measurable, and point solutions that tend to be easier to get started with. And then we start to think about what happens with public demand or crisis. And so part of that we see, with open data and data sharing. There was really a crisis of confidence in local governments. And the response was, let's be more transparent, let's engage more, let's start to work on our open data programs. Let's have some hackathons and bring people in to help us solve problems. The other trend that I mentioned is, around public safety. We see a big uptick, obviously, in body-worn videos to try to both record events and keep everyone on both sides more honest and really deal with the crisis that we've had of confidence in policing in this country. And then also, I mentioned water monitoring, which is also happening more and more in terms of the quality of water and the availability of water over time. So the point of talking about these use cases, one, if you're a municipality that's sort of looking to invest, and you may not be high in the, down the path like some of the cities we know are in this area, that kind of discussion on, what drives funding and where the type of funding can be, whether that it's a point solution or it's a more complex solution, can really help think about where you could get started. The thing that I think is really important and that we talk about a lot, and we actually saw the very similar graphic that was shown in the smart peanut farming video, except instead of a car, they had a truck. I don't know what it is, a plow, a digger? I don't actually know. But anyway, something that they do in smart peanut farming. The issue is you have all these solutions that are happening on their own, possibly within a department, and they're still siloed, which is exactly the way IT systems have kind of functioned and been developed in cities over time. The value of smart cities is in interconnectivity. It's in data sharing. It's not in more siloed point solutions. So while there's tremendous value in having a great smart trash collection or parking, the value is actually in how that parking information then gets shared with other transportation departments and other use cases. So that's where we start to really have to think about how do we take IT and the departmental initiatives and actually have them function the way cities function, which is that they're interdependent and they're interconnected. And that's where we start to talk more and more about APIs to share data, data standards, smart city platforms. And these things sound really boring, but they're actually really important if you're gonna get the value out of these investments over time. And the other complexity is, and I just show this graphic, which is how many organizations and vendors are involved in these solutions. So even if you're doing a point solution, you're often working with several types of partners. And so it does become complex to think about these investments when it's not as simplistic or straightforward. And I don't know if you guys have heard me speak, I mention this example all the time, but I just love it so much, which is working with the Parks Department and talking with the Smart Parks Department in New York City, and they were gonna implement a solar-powered bench, and they were gonna collect some data from the bench, and it was gonna tell them about park usage. And their idea was that they were gonna procure it exactly the same way as a regular bench. And you can't procure a smart connected device the same way as your traditional device, right? Because there's data and there's privacy and there's all sorts of issues. So you really need to think about these things quite differently, and you're working with quite different people than you might normally work with. Okay, so we've talked about these use cases and where the investment's going. How do we start to think about these use cases in terms of their timing and interdependencies? It's very interesting to say, oh, smart parking is a point solution. We kind of all know that. It solves one problem. But it's more interesting to start to think of, okay, if I think of my portfolio of projects, what might the interdependencies be? What might the touch points that are key for data sharing be? And if I know these and I can think about these, I can have a more strategic roadmap for how I'm investing in these various things over time. Or I can have a more strategic discussion with the department next door that might be doing something that could be interdependent to me. So the one thing that we're working on, and I'm going to say this is still a work in progress because there's a few things in Horizon 1 that I no longer think is shaded correctly, but we basically said, okay, so here's the sort of now horizon for what's actually happening now and what's being invested in now, and then the middle term and more pie in the sky long-term types of use cases. And then we said, okay, so let's talk about what might have some interdependencies to each other that might be interesting to think about when you think about investing. So priority 1, maybe point, maybe easier to deploy, maybe less complex, and then we try to put them next to each other to think about which ones are related. So for example, we have open data that often is related to permitting and licensing information. That's a key use case that people start to share in terms of open data, and it has a really big impact on businesses and citizens. It's also related to portals. A lot of cities have portals, and the open data might be a portal within that portal. So how are these related as initiatives that you might be working on? And then we have the second priority, which is somewhat more complex, maybe somewhat more costly, and then finally sort of things like real-time crime centers and in-car camera systems that might have much more things to think about in terms of data transfer and privacy and security, issues like that that make it somewhat more complex than some of the other situations. So this is sort of a trend, a way we're looking at trends in investing and spending to try to really think about these solutions as interdependent and related portfolio of projects. So really just in conclusion, I have a couple sort of wrapping up slides. And this is some, and the first one is actually really was highlighted with the work we did with Raleigh, which is what are some trends for action? And one of them is really looking at your growth and how you're managing growth, because a lot of this discussion comes around whether your growth is going up or whether you're trying to retain talent and retain people or have people move to your area. So how does this portfolio of solutions you're looking at relate to the issue of growth management? How are you laying a foundation? So what happens a lot in municipalities is you kind of may buy a solution and then hope you can ingest the data into some existing system. And a lot of times, maybe you can't very well. So how do you think about laying a strategic foundation through really going out and having an RFP to help someone have you do your strategy, have you develop an assessment, maybe an IT audit to understand what systems you have and what they're capable of, and then being able to layer on your portfolio on top of that once you have kind of a strategic foundation. The other thing in terms of trends is that the city council is getting more involved and I think more interested. We've had a lot more discussions with folks on the politician side in terms of what's happening here, so I think that's a really interesting trend you can proactively take. The other issue is really looking at addressing the issue of scaling. So not only do we have this interconnectivity of use cases, but also you have to think about scaling them. It's good to have a smart parking system for a couple blocks, but that doesn't really solve your parking problem. So how do you scale and implement solutions that may be technology heavy and infrastructure heavy and costly actually over time? And how do you look at different relationships and different types of business models to do that? And the other thing, just the last two things I think that we see kind of being talked about more, but not enough, is the issue around security and privacy. And security being that you have a lot more endpoints, you have a lot more, what do they call, attack surfaces, right? How are you actually dealing with the security of these systems, and also the security on the back end of your older systems, which may not actually be capable of dealing with some of the security breaches you have. And so if we have interdependent portfolios of projects, what does that mean when one gets breached? How does that start to affect maybe other systems in the city? And the other piece is when we start to talk more and more about analytics, and we start to talk about machine learning and artificial analytics, we're actually the human may not intervene, and there may be automated responses based on machine learning. How do we ethically manage this automation? So as we start to think of proactive and automated response based on this sort of AI, how do we treat AI as a person? How do we treat them in a way that they actually have to follow the same rules and laws that govern a person? And how do we think about doing AI ethically? And so these are questions, I think, that we're just starting to talk about, but I think they're extremely important going forward. So when we think about some steps, and this is about really investing, and it has a little more of a platform view in terms of these 5 steps, and I apologize, the writing's a little bit small, but it's really, start identifying your use cases if you're just starting out, that you think are key and important, and how they overline with this overall smart city strategy that you have. And really, we heard the panel on community engagement talking about this, which is talking and bringing in and collaborating with the other departments. So there's actually a sense of all the different projects that might be happening within the municipality and how they relate to one another. And that's part of the internal working groups. And I think it's also valuable to get beyond your comfort zone in terms of the vendors you're working with. I mean, nobody likes risk. People like to work with who they've worked with, and you have relationships. Those relationships are important because you know the people, and if you trust them, that's great. But I think there's also value in getting other opinions, getting innovative ideas, stepping a little bit outside of your comfort zone to see what else is out there. And so I just encourage really looking at sort of other people behind, beyond your traditional ecosystem of players. And then the last piece really is just around platforms and thinking about interconnectivity, which is developing them. They don't have to be big, huge models. You can develop them incrementally. But I think when you're implementing use cases, you really have to start to think about how these things interact and how the data is shared and how you're going to manage getting the outcomes you want from these systems. And that involves a lot of governance and policies as well. Right, so you really have to think about all that wrapper around the IT that becomes more important. And then finally, just a couple things, I think this is reiterating what I've already said, but, I think it was worth saying what I said again. A lot of times people say, oh, we're going to shift from CapEx to OpEx. That's not that straightforward. I think we all know that. We've seen the city of Boston, or maybe the state of Massachusetts, is actually going to be using some of their capital budgets to fund some innovative IT in their open data programs. I think the capital budgets funds the analytics department within the city of Boston. So there's ways that you can actually use your existing models in creative ways as well, if it's not that easy for you to shift, from these investment models within your city. And I think, when we think of free and less risk, it could be. It could also be free and it only lasts 6 months and then you're left with nothing. So I think in the context of managing risk and testing pilots, you do have to be very clear in understanding where that leaves you in the long term in terms of testing and scaling these initiatives. And then finally, and this is, I think, the main point, which is, once again, you can't have the maximum benefits from these systems if they operate the same way government has always operated, which is pretty disparate and pretty siloed. They really have to have some sort of comprehensive view and strategy that think about them as interdependent units that are really driving for the outcomes for your businesses and residents. So thank you. I'll let you all get back to your lunch. I really appreciate, I don't know if you finished eating, but a lot of people stopped eating, so I really appreciate that. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.